Buenos dias, and I will now switch to English. Good morning, everyone. It's great to be here, actually to be back here, because I already had the pleasure of participating in this conference a couple of years ago, and I have continued to find it extremely interesting. The topics very well chosen, and the same is true for the current program here. What I'd like to do in the next half hour or so is to share a few thoughts with you on the statistical landscape as I perceive it, but I hasten to stress that there's no claim of completeness or an exhaustive treatment of the various topics in there. I was very pleased to note, however, that quite a few of the things that I will be saying chime very well with what we just heard from the governor in terms of microdata, new sources, and tools that are being used. So here's what I will be doing. I will give you a little bit of background. That won't be much of a surprise. I will then say a few words about where I think the main areas are, or how we should see the contents of this new landscape of data that we are pursuing. Move on to speak a little bit to the tools and sources that are available, and then finish up with some considerations regarding the institutional setup that is needed to bring all these things to fruition. So, by way of setting the scene, none of this will come as a big surprise. The environment in which statisticians are operating is evolving quickly, shaped by the digital transformation with issues of volume and ownership of data. Of course, the whole debate about artificial intelligence is with us. We have new policy challenges, climate change, inequality, and so on, many of which require cross-cutting policies, and very often cross-cutting policies require cross-cutting data to provide evidence. I'll say a few words more about this in a minute. There's also, at least in quite a few countries, stronger views being issued on evidence and beliefs about data and scientific knowledge. It's more often contested maybe than in the past, or the way people look at evidence or not at evidence or false evidence is something that is, of course, highly relevant for our statistical world as well. The various shocks and events and structural changes that we have experienced came with a strong demand for more timely, more granular, and trusted data as well. And if you think of the pandemic, of course, everything really was about getting information now and getting it at a level of detail that would allow us to say something about how the pandemic has affected firms of different sizes, how it has affected men and women, how it has affected different parts of the economy, different locations in our countries. So all this granularity that came out really strongly and has stayed with us ever since. So where does this leave the official statistics? And this is where I'll say a few words about the substance, or the things that I think we want to look at, and we've started to look at, in providing the evidence and the services to our policymakers, to our stakeholders, to society at large that we need. I always like to, as a statistician as well, to systematize things a little bit, and I have found it useful to structure the thoughts around the areas that seem to be most important in three ways. First of all, I think there is a well-established statistical system around what I call production. So this is really where we think about how our economy works with inputs, with outputs. This is, of course, the home to the national accounts. And that's relatively well established. But there are quite a few things in there that we would like to develop further. For example, measuring digitalization, or for example, thinking more about how natural capital actually influences the sphere of production. We also want to go beneath the aggregates in there within the established statistical system. I'll give you one or two examples there. Then there's this whole area of what we call current well-being, which is really around the beyond GDP debate. That is bringing in those dimensions that are not covered typically in the production sphere, but which have become increasingly important to look at. What I'm talking about here is information and indicators about health, about work-life balance, about social engagement, about governance, about security, all those things that go beyond the purely material well-being, but which need to be recognized in our statistical systems. And thirdly, we need to keep a good handle on assets and measure them well. We are, doing a pretty good job on the produced capital. There is work on human capital. There's quite some activity also ongoing around the environment, but more can be done. And as we look into these different areas, we will be able to detect those construction sites that need our attention most urgently. Importantly also, it is sometimes very interesting to look at the links between these spheres. I was talking about cross-cutting policy issues before. Simple example, if you think of environmental policies, you cannot inform and define environmental policies these days without giving due consideration to current well-being, to questions of distributions, to questions of quality of life. So just by giving you a few examples behind these blocks, one is within our well-established accounts, we want to make sure we do not only look at aggregates, but we go beneath GDP. The most simple example here is pay more attention to household accounts because they tell you more about what is going on with material well-being among households. All countries have these statistics, and they do not always move in the same direction as GDP does. Another issue of sort of going beneath GDP is developing consistent data about the distribution of income, consumption, wealth, or savings. All countries, or most countries, do have information on distribution of income, but typically they are not consistent with the national account, so you can't make this macro-micro link. Well, for some years now, there has been an activity in OECD countries and beyond to construct these distributional measures that are consistent with the national accounts aggregates. And I could, talk for about 15 minutes just on this graph, how the development of these consistent measures can change the picture of inequality and its development in our countries. Beyond GDP, I said that was really in this well-being area. If you ask or look at social research, what counts for people in their lives, and that's pretty consistent across countries. What you will hear is typically three things. Health comes first, okay, then income, and then friends. Okay, so social connections is really important. And capturing this with systems of indicators is really fundamental to be able to be relevant to broad parts of of society. And indeed, many OECD countries now have developed dashboards of well-being indicators with different components, different time frames. But there's a lot of communality actually between them, because many of the things that I was mentioning before are true pretty much across countries. Assets, that is the third area that I was alluding to. And I said, well, we are reasonably in reasonably good shape when we talk about produced assets. So this is typically the capital stock that we find in our national accounts. There is a part of the national accounts capital stock that is actually recognized in our system of national accounts, but not always measured well or not measured at all. These are the non-produced, non-financial assets. What do I mean here? Land, for example. There are not many OECD countries who have good measures of land and its value in the accounts. So it includes subsoil assets and measures thereof. So this is all part of the current SNA, actually, and there's a matter of filling the current accounting system. And then, of course, we can go further and think about other environmental assets that may include, in particular, the renewables, like timber, fish, soil, water, and so on. That we're sort of progressively getting out of the current system of national accounts. Also, human capital. There's a lot of long tradition of academic work ongoing on human capital, mainly through measuring discounted lifetime incomes. And then we can go even further and think about ecosystem accounting, which is very much an important topic these days, where you get spatially defined information on ecosystems and ecosystem services that are being provided. And of course, social capital in the sense of measuring trust, and in trust in others, but also trust in institutions, a very important topic these days. From a statistical perspective, there is a key question, that is, how far can we go, or should we go, in terms of monetizing these values? Of course, produced capital, that's well understood. Non-produced financial debt as well, but it's sort of, the further we go in this direction, the harder it is to put a reliable, robust money value on these assets. And it's an important discussion, how far to go, what are the costs and benefit of monetary valuation of some of these assets. But whether they are measured in physical terms or in monetary terms, measuring them is really important. Partially, the assets are included also in the update of the system of national accounts, especially when it comes to natural resources and the greater granularity that is being developed on environment economy assets. Again, we could have a separate seminar on this, which I will not go into now. Just to summarize on this part of contents of where do we want to go to is first we want to look beneath or develop data beneath and beyond GDP. Secondly, as I said, let's think about the linkages of some of these spheres, because that is the great policy challenge, to have these policies defined in a way that they capture different environmental, social, economic aspects. There are, of course, the effects of digitalization, globalization, that are partially still fully in the production sphere and very worth exploring, and we'll have a whole session here in this conference on that very topic. Assets, I just spoke to this. This is very much like you're examining a firm And okay, you look at profits and losses, but what you really look at is the balance sheet. I mean, this tells you something about the health of the company, and we should have the same approach when we think about countries and societies. Finally, the spatial and socioeconomic granularity that I already alluded to at the very beginning. There's this expectation now also from users and from policymakers that data is just more granular. And it's also society. People want to know what is happening not only in the country at large, but what is happening in their region, in their neighborhood, partially in their street, because you have all these tools also to look at those. So what are the tools and the sources to get some of this granularity and this timeliness to play that we are all looking at? Well, here I put up a graph that has two parts. And on the right-hand side, you see a number of policy questions that are being dealt with in various parts of the OECD, and going from territorial disparities in services accessibility to digital divide in rural areas or heat islands in metropolitan areas. On the left hand, you have a number of sources, and I could challenge you to link the sources to the policy question, and you'd be surprised what sort of sources are being used for which policy questions to shed some light on this. The main purpose being that you see you have a variety of very different new sources that are being used, and they can be used in very innovative ways to answer some of these questions in a timely and a granular way. Example, again, this is a very unrepresentative selection of 2 or 3 examples. Urban and rural divide concerning connectivity, the traditional collection of data about from surveys about internet access is not very useful anymore these days. But what you would like to know is how fast internet access is in various parts of your country. Well, you go to one of these speed test platforms, and the OECD has an arrangement with Ookla, and you can map those things out and see that there is a lot of that didn't come out. There is a graph here that didn't come out in the PDF. Okay. Anyway, this is a graph that shows that there is a big difference between urban and rural areas in the speed of internet access. The second example is from geospatial data, which is of course a big item these days to assess land use and land use statistics, and artificial intelligence is used to train the satellite information with atlases, with established atlases, so that the land use can be recognized basically worldwide and basically in real time, and get an idea about land and built up areas much faster than it was possible in the past. Third example is again a combination of data from satellite imaging with census data, where it is possible to get an idea about the exposure of parts of the population to air pollution by combining the population density data with the satellite data on air pollution. Again, that is, so you get maps worldwide, comparable, and so on. I could go on with the examples here, and I'm sure in your own institutions you have just as many or more, and just as interesting ones. The issue that, of course, concerns us and everyone else also is how do we deal with quality assurance when we use these new sources. They do raise new quality issues. for everyone who uses them, for the OECD in particular, because traditionally we have, and we still do, get a lot of data, official data from the countries, and of course we don't have to worry too much about the accuracy of this data because it comes out of the official statistical system. But we do have to worry about the accuracy and the quality of our data if we produce this data ourselves, if we ourselves generate these sources. There's also an issue about privacy that comes along with great granularity of the data. I mean, the further you dig down, the higher the probability that individuals or individual firms can be identified by linking the sources. That problem increases the smaller the country or the smaller the sample, of course. We should also not forget that quality is multidimensional. It's not only about accuracy, it's about the timeliness of the data, about how accessible it is, how reproducible the statistics are that we produce with the new sources, and how secure things can be handled and saved. And for us, and probably for many others as well, this means that the traditional quality assurance frameworks that we have been using to assess our statistical work have to be revised, because you have new dimensions that come in and have to be dealt with. A word here on AI. There's a separate session, and I'm not going to elaborate greatly on this. This is, of course, on everybody's mind, especially since we have seen generative AI happening. I think there are many opportunities associated with AI, in particular, in our area, in particular, when it comes to replacing human-intensive statistical activities like classifying, imputing records. Things will also help in terms of user support, because users can search with natural language. Coding, translation of different codes from one to another will be or are already helped. AI opens up new methods. I read an article about house prices that are being assessed with pictures from with Google Street pictures, and simply by training the algorithm, apparently you can come up with pretty accurate estimates of house prices just by letting the algorithm looking at the picture of your house. And so that replaces, in a way, some of the traditional methods that we've been using to measure quality-adjusted house prices in our statistical system. It will help findability of data across our whole data ecosystems. And on the institutional side, I think AI opens up all sorts of possibilities also for the system of official statistics to retain, regain, and revive in this new context, because the official statistical institutions have a lot to offer to deal with some of the challenges in AI. Challenges, and I already mentioned quality assurance. I should add also the investment that is needed to harness AI. I mean, this is, yes, there are a lot of software for free, but actually to use it, you need to invest properly. Change management is important in everyone's institutions, and the development of human skills also. I mean, your staff needs to be brought into this space. That happens, or it doesn't happen, or it happens for some people, but it's something important to retain. That brings me already to this third aspect that I wanted to cover, the question of institutions in this new ecosystem, and the importance of data stewardship. So we see many technical developments, we see developments in contents, but things need to be set in the right institutional framework. And very often the institutional side of things, or even the legal side of things, can be more important than the technical capabilities if you want to use new tools and new sources. So the discussion about data stewardship is something that has been with us for a number of years now. The international statistical community has been looking at this question with increasing interest. The way I see it is that data stewardship is really the implementation of policies, standards, and principles of data governance. And data governance is the broader decision-making and authority for data-related issues in society. Data stewardship, in our context, is more the implementation of this in a particular area, namely in the area where you produce, set up data for analysis, for information, for policy definition. There are different definitions around, but I think that I find this the most appealing way of looking at it. And in this context, there is a discussion of who should be data stewards in a country. And you can come down in various ways on this, but of course I think there's a good point to be made that the members of the national statistical system, or one of them, typically NSO or another partner, should be operating as data stewards because they have a lot to offer. I mean, there's a legal basis, there's a history of data ethics, there are quality frameworks, they are professionals in protection of privacy and confidentiality of data. There's familiarity with classifications and standard, and they're the guardians of the basic statistical infrastructure. And I think also involving established statistical bodies in data governance or data stewardship for the country is one way of reducing also the trade-off that we often observe between generating evidence with new data and protecting privacy on the other hand, because you have professional bodies that deal with data protection and so on. So it makes things a little easier, and there's trust typically in official statistical bodies more than in others. If you think of this data ecosystem and the institutional setup, what are the ingredients that we would need to go forward when we implement those? The first one is, I mentioned this already, a strong legal and ethical basis. This may sound obvious, but it is not always obvious in different countries because you need this social acceptance and the trust in the institution. Otherwise, you can't take the stakeholders with you. And you need a good statistical law, not only a law, but also a law that is implemented and that is truly in place. There are recurring discussions about statistics law and how it can be taken forward. There is data protection, of course, that is also needed and is also legally defined. And sometimes there is a bit of a conflict of interest between the two. When it comes, for example, handing over confidential data for statistical purposes. Not in every country. Chile is a good example where tax data is now being increasingly used for business statistics. I think this is fantastic, but it's not a matter of course everywhere. Other countries where this is much less clear. Ethical standards need to be credibly implemented and communicated on. And of course, this sort of ongoing dialogue with people, explaining that you do get better and more trusted information if you look at the official data rather than just going into social media to get evidence for the things that you want to know about. Second is common standards and interoperability of the national statistical system. So what I mean here is that we need to work towards to use of common classifications between different parts of the administration. Metadata standards to bring data usefully for statistical purposes. It is important that we as statisticians know exactly what is in the data that other parts of the administrations hold. The common data quality frameworks and some sort of interoperability framework that allows the data to speak to each other, because it is by linking the different sources that you can get to the really interesting policy questions. This is a big job, and it's a job, of course, for the data steward that is nominated in countries. I'm quoting here the example of Switzerland, which has gone quite far in this aspect. They have established what they call a metadata catalog. So it allows you to know what sort of data each part of the Swiss administration at the federal, but also at the local level holds. You can't access every piece of data, but already knowing which data resides where and how is it structured and whom can you talk to if you are interested in some of this is a huge way forward. And it has generated a process also in Switzerland where the different parts of the administrations have come around to structuring their data in a way so that it fits better into this metadata system. They also have to explain why data is not accessible. Very often there are good reasons for that, but the very fact that you're obliged to say, well, this data cannot be made available for research or other purposes because of this and this and this, has changed some of the dynamics as to the situation before. They also provide access or help to researchers and statisticians in accessing some of these data. There are other countries who have also gone down that route, but I just wanted to show the Swiss example. Third and lastly, as I said before, much investment is needed to harness these new sources, new tools, to go into new areas and to do things. And it turns out that many of the institutions do actually have similar needs, and the budgets are finite for most of us, so we need to go beyond just coordination and exchange of information to co-investment, to actually put our money together where it's worth doing so, because we have the same needs. And here are 2 or 3 examples of things of institutions where this is already happening, but I think more can be done. One is the so-called HLG MOS, that's the high-level group for the modernization of statistics. It's a group of chief statisticians that have come together to basically think about production processes in their offices and how things can develop, and it's co-funded, it's organized under the Conference of European Statisticians. We ourselves have the Statistical Information System Collaboration Community that is organized around developing a platform for data management in statistical offices in the OECD, and the institutions that you see here contribute financially to the development of this software. That is just much less expensive than if everyone did their own software development for pretty much the same purpose. Things can then be modular so that they are They are customer specific, but the basic principles, the basic tools are developed jointly. Third example is the Development Data Partnership. That's a confederation of international organizations, the IDB, IMF, World Bank, OECD, with a view to being able to have a single voice when we talk to the big platforms to tap into their data. Okay, so on the other side are these platforms, Google, LinkedIn, and so on, who are ready to share some of the information data they have for research and statistical purposes. But they are not ready to discuss this with 5 different OECD directorates and 2 departments in the IMF, but having a single place where the legal foundations, the template, the licenses are being agreed on and operated has been very useful to advance this. But again, it happens because the international organizations, we co-fund this and then enable our staff to tap into this resource. For the firms, it's quite interesting too, because it's cheaper for them, but also they get a certain recognition being part of this partnership, and it helps them reflect also how they deal or how they manage their own data asset. So co-investment is the word, I think, that takes us beyond just coordination. To conclude, there's a whole new world out there, data for evidence. I said 3 times already, there's this enormous demand for granularity and trusted evidence. Our digitalization brings many opportunities, also some challenges, but I think the opportunities overall are much bigger than the challenges. We need and should not forget about the legal, institutional, and sort of the soft things like trust in institutions that are needed to get this through. It's not only a technical and data issue to harness these opportunities. And I do think that our system, our national statistical systems, the players in the official statistics really have a role to play going forward. And on that, I thank you very much for your attention.